Is the Denver Broncos pairing of Sean Payton and Russell Wilson sustainable? We're going to take a look at every side of the coin of what the Broncos would look like if they run it back with Russ or if they choose to move on. We look at every angle on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
With 2 weeks remaining in the NFL regular season, what is the Denver Broncos' plan with Russell Wilson and Sean Payton maybe going into next season? We'll take a look at that in today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Hope you all had a Merry Christmas, Broncos Country. We're so appreciative of you. As always, thank you so much for making us your first listen of the day every single day. You can get this podcast for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. Do us a favor, if you've not done so already, subscribe or follow so you never miss out on what's going on with your favorite team every single day, all year long. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Last-minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports. Joined alongside, as always, by Sayre Bedinger, site expert, predominantlyorange.com. Sayre and our Locked on Broncos post-game report here. Obviously, for everyone that tuned in Broncos Country, we kind of teased a little bit and talked about, okay, hey, with 2 weeks left in the regular season, what is the Broncos' plans? There's been some rumblings. There's been some rumors out there about maybe Denver either running it back with Russ or maybe not running it back with Russ. And there's some ripple effects that obviously I think we need to talk about as it pertains to the bigger picture. I think the first question we have to ask ourselves here in perspective and also thinking forward a little bit, is the Broncos' dynamic pairing of Sean Payton and Russell Wilson, is it sustainable? This is a question I feel like could have a lot of answers to it.
Definitely could have a lot of answers and go down a lot of roads, right? I mean, when you're talking about, well, if this, then what? You know, if Russell Wilson, changes his contract in 2024, then what is the working relationship between these two guys like? And if the Broncos get such and such at certain positions, I mean, there's so many different rabbit trails that you could go down with this one. But I think ultimately we have to consider the idea that, I mean, this offense was built around Russell Wilson for a year. Did Sean Payton sign up for multiple years of Russell Wilson, right? That's what we don't know and probably will never know because we'll never be a fly on the wall. We can't go back and hear those conversations between Sean Payton and the ownership group when he was in the process of getting hired and things like that. But I think ultimately you kind of just have to look at the story that this season has told. When you look at the Broncos and their success offensively, where has it largely come from? It's come from big plays and clutch moments. It's not really come from consistent, sustained success. The Broncos aren't averaging a ton of plays per drive. They're not really successful overall in terms of like game to game running the football. They're not successful game to game in terms of throwing for a lot of first downs. It's been a lot of just kind of moments in games and the defense keeping them in during that, 9-8 game stretch there. And really, Cody, I just don't know if that ultimately, when you talk about relationship between Sean Payton and Russell Wilson, I don't know how sustainable over time that's really going to be.
When you talked about Payton coming in and building this offense, what is the one thing he told us in the offseason? You're going to take a look at Russ's greatest hits, what he does well, right? And it's being able to roll them out and throw on the run there. And when Russ has been off schedule this year, when he's been able to run and throw and use his legs, you mentioned it, big plays, clutch moments. Russell Wilson has demonstrated a lot of the old school Russell Wilson that we saw with the Seattle Seahawks. But then there are moments, right? And this is where I think the biggest question about sustainability comes in. And I want to preface this by saying, look, it's not all Russell Wilson's fault. And I think so many fans just like, oh, look at Russ. Russ is not playing to the standard of which, his contract is. I get so tired of hearing that, he's getting paid this much money. He should be lighting it up. It's not just about Russ. Russ cannot do it by himself. Now, can Russ be better in areas as a quarterback? 100%, right? We can talk about things like maybe getting the play in quickly, getting set up. We can also talk about maybe even some decisions here. But for the most part, Russell Wilson hasn't put the Broncos in a lot of harm's way this year, the way that I think the narrative was a little bit more defined last season under Nathaniel Hackett. The problem here, though, is that when you mention it, the Broncos cannot run the football, Sayre. They're running into a lot of issues offensively, like a logjam. And look, I don't know if this is just maybe fresh off of the New England game, but the moment that Courtland Sutton went down with an injury, left due to a concussion, everything kind of crumbled here for Denver because they couldn't run the ball against New England. And then they didn't have any pass catching options. And this kind of goes to where, is this offense built sustainably, right? And this isn't on Russ. This is where it's on Sean Payton, who apparently we don't talk about, or we don't hold Sean Payton accountable enough, Sayre. And I think that's ridiculous. We talked about it in our post game. But the idea and the fact, okay, Cortland Sutton, your best wide receiver, goes down in the first quarter, and you don't target another wide receiver like Jerry. Jerry Jeudy saw his first target at the 9-minute, 12-second mark of the fourth quarter. And all of a sudden, when you start getting the ball to Jerry, things are happening. The drive's moving. Russ is eluding pressure. He's doing the stuff that he's done in Seattle before. And all of a sudden, the Broncos storm back there. This is where I think there's just a disconnect with the offense, because it was really a dink and dunk approach for a good portion of the game until that fourth quarter. And it's not all on Russell Wilson. Like I said, collectively, the offensive line didn't have their greatest night in terms of protection either. But this is where my frustration with Sean Payton from a play calling standpoint comes in, because why was he calling a conservative game for the most part until Russ had to go let it rip? To me, it's confusing.
Yeah, it is kind of confusing. I mean, it's the same principle for those that remember the Tebow season, right? It's like your offense struggled for 3.5 quarters. Then all of a sudden you cut Tebow loose, and it's like, wait, he can actually throw the ball. Or, I mean, not that Tebow was the greatest passer. I'm not trying to start another debate here, Cody, about something else, but just it's a similar situation to where it's like, why can't we do this all the time? And why can't we throw like this all the time? Why can't we cut Russ loose most of the time? Why can't we let him throw downfield a little bit more? It just feels like it takes those desperation times or the 2-minute drive or things like that for the offense to really get going, which, where is the disconnect there? Where is it happening? Is it, we've talked about before also the Broncos excelling on the script as well. And it really seems like outside of those things that we're not seeing any sort of consistency offensively. Remember we talked in the offseason about Cortland Sutton or Jerry Jeudy, they might become the slant god like Michael Thomas, right? There's really no slants happening in this offense. There's not much in terms of crossing patterns over the middle of the field. Although the Broncos do rank among the better teams in the NFL in yards after the catch, that's mostly coming from the running back position, right? I mean, we're not seeing a ton of yards after the catch from the receivers this year. And that's, I think, again, a critique. Isn't it funny? We talked a lot last year from people in the comments who were asking us, hey, why are you not putting enough pressure on Russell Wilson? Why are you guys saying so many good things about Russell Wilson? You're blaming only the coaches. And it's just funny how things kind of flip and the tables have turned at this point now. Now we're getting accused of doing too much, talking down about Russ and not enough about the coach. So it's just kind of funny how things work out. But I think you can see that disconnect there. And where the Broncos go from here is going to be fascinating. I know there's 2 games left, but I think there's still something to be said for that. So it's really just a fascinating situation, Cody, and I don't know what the Broncos are going to do.
Well, and that kind of leads us into our next talking point here on today's episode of Locked On Broncos, where we're going to ask the question, what would it look like if the Broncos and Russell Wilson did not run it back this upcoming season? We're going to dive deep into that conversation here on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos. Today's Locked On Broncos podcast is brought to you by our friends over there at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. And as the weather gets colder, the NFL, they offer to stay hot on FanDuel. Right now, new customers, they can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 money line bet. Over the weekend, I ended up putting $5 on the money line for the Denver Nuggets to beat the Golden State Warriors. I woke up with $150 in bonus bets because guess what? My team won. Same thing can apply to you on FanDuel Sportsbook. And if you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there's no better time to get in on the action than right now. The NFL playoff race is heating up. Things are getting excited all across the NFL. On top of that, the NBA is on the court. The NHL, they are on the ice, and you can get in on all the action on FanDuel. The app is so easy to use. There's a wide range of betting options that include spreads, player props, over-unders, and more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off the NFL season. Once again, FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, the official partner of the NFL.
What will it look like if the Denver Broncos do part ways with Russell Wilson after the 2023 season? What's the financial ramification of all that? What could the roster fallout be? All those things we're going to talk about right here on this episode of Locked On Broncos, but want to say a huge shout out and thank you to every single one of you everydayers out there that listens to Locked On Broncos every day right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day, anywhere that you get podcasts, free and available there, as well as on YouTube, where you can watch the show and engage with other members of Broncos Country in the comment section and let us know your thoughts. What do you think about the Broncos and Russell Wilson's situation? Do you think it is an option to move on from him after this season? Let us know what you think. And Cody, let's talk about this, because the Broncos already they're into Russell Wilson $39 million next season. There's no question about it. It's I believe roughly $85 million dead cap hit if they do cut him in 2024. But there's more than meets the eye there, right? It's not just as simple as, well, they owe him 39 million and there's 85 dead cap and things like that. There's some different conversations about this that deal with 2025 as well that I think are important for Broncos Country to understand.
No, 100% too, right? And look, you mentioned a great point about the 39 guaranteed million. Like, that's his number next year. But I think we've been talking about it, we've been alluding to it here as well. There's been some rumblings about what is the Broncos' decision on Russell Wilson going to be by the time that fifth day of the new league year rolls around, where an additional $37 million of his gets kicked in as an automatic guarantee. That makes things very interesting. Now, I checked over at our friends over there at Spot Track, which is a great resource. And this was just basically what I did is you can go in and you can manage the roster, which is a great tool for anybody that wants to play around with the salary cap, because guess what? I was never great at math and I don't like to do these calculations in my head. So thank goodness that the people at Spot Track or Over the Cap, they do this stuff for us. But if the Broncos were to cut Russell Wilson, let's say hypothetically speaking, after the season ends, they were to move on from Russ via release, then the Broncos' overall estimated salary cap space for next year would be minus $13.2 million in cap space. Now, I think one thing we have to factor in here, Sayre, is it's going to change and fluctuate because there's other deals that players, are going to be up for. There's a lot of roster shuffling, I think, that would have to happen. There would have to be a lot of salary cap gymnastics. So at this point in time, I'm not necessarily jealous of Rich Hurtado and his job with the Denver Broncos, because it seems like a very painful thing to have to navigate here. But there is something out there, right? There was that rumor, and this is something that cannot be banked on as a guarantee. And I hope NFL teams, and I'm sure the Broncos aren't banking on this either, but there was a rumor and a rumbling that the salary cap could jump up to an estimated $240 million. Sayre, if that were to happen, that would give the Broncos some flexibility. Not much, but it would help make it a little bit easier than it currently is right now. At this point in time, if that was the move here for Denver, I mean, Sayre, Denver would be over the cap significantly here in this situation. And on top of that, they may have to approach some of their other players about maybe restructuring their deals.
They definitely will. I think even if they keep Russ or if they cut Russ, I think you're looking at potentially approaching some of the big name guys like Garrett Bowles, Justin Simmons, Cortland Sutton. Certainly Tim Patrick as well is a player on that list. And then, of course, when you sign big players to free agent contracts like last year, Mike McGlinchey, Ben Powers, those guys are going to have situations in their contract built for this, where you're looking at, okay, we have Russell Wilson's contract kicking in next year. How do we need to structure these deals going in? So I guarantee you, Rich Hurtado, he's already thinking a year or two down the line, and I bet you they have something written in those guys' deals to where they can say, hey, let's kick this to a roster bonus or a signing bonus, and that'll free up this much cap space. So we're going to start to see the Broncos do things salary cap wise that really we haven't ever seen them do before, because the biggest contract in history for this team at the quarterback position previous to Russ was Peyton Manning. And those were different times, right? Those were very different times in the NFL. That was 10 years ago. So, I mean, we're talking about completely different situation now. But as you talk about these restructures and things like that, what about Russell Wilson as a potential restructure? I mean, I would say it's unprecedented to ask a quarterback to give back $37 million if I hadn't just seen Aaron Rodgers do something like that. And so I don't know where Russ lands on that. I mean, the Broncos, remember when they signed him to that contract, 124 million guaranteed practical guarantees, 161 million guaranteed at signing. So what does that mean? The difference between those two is this 37 million that we're talking about, where the Broncos now have a choice. Do we want to bite the bullet on the 39 million this year and say goodbye to Russ and keep that 37 million in cash for next year? Or do we want to try to approach him about redoing this contract entirely? And I think that's the only way that we see him come back to Denver.
I think that's a fair point too. And look, after the game, Russ was asked about his future here in Denver, and he says, I'm not thinking too far ahead about that, and rightfully so. I mean, as a player, I'm sure you never want to think about those things. Look, here's the thing: Russ sees everything. Russ sees everything that people write about him. Russ hears all the conversation. I'm sure Russ has listened to our show here, and the reality of the situation is that our opinions at the end of the day really don't matter. We're here to facilitate conversation and discussion. I don't feel any way about it. I think Russ is a great person. I think Russ has actually played pretty well at the quarterback position this year, but I think that the offensive scheme and design has not been conducive around him consistently. And there's areas where there's deficiencies. And so with that being said, when you look at where Denver's at from a roster standpoint, if they were to move on from him after this year, Sayre, I think the biggest question that we're all asking ourselves here now is, okay, well, what is the Broncos' plan at quarterback then? Like, if they are planning to move on from Russ, does this mean, are they going to look in free agency? Are they going to roll a season with Jarrett Stidham and Ben DiNucci as the backup quarterback? Maybe not have the greatest type of outlook for the season potentially, or are they going to draft a young guy? Like, for me personally, Sayre, if Denver were to move on from Russ after this year, I think you go out in this year's draft and I think you get a quarterback. And I think you have to figure out how can Sean Payton put his hands and his fingerprints on him. I mean, obviously, Jaden Daniels is the guy, the quarterback out of LSU everyone's talking about. Is Denver going to be in a position to get him? I don't know, because there's so many teams right now in the NFL ahead of Denver that will be picking way before Denver is, that are going to look at a quarterback, like so many teams. And that, I think, is the ultimate wild card about, okay, well, if you're doing this with Russ, if you're going to move on, you better have a real solidified plan here. But I would not, I mean, I also wouldn't be shocked if Russ himself decided to restructure his contract. I wouldn't. I think he would do that, contrary to what many people believe that he wouldn't.
Yeah, if you saying that kind of makes me wonder if Russell Wilson would go elsewhere in 2024, does that make Jarrett Stidham the odds-on favorite to be the starting quarterback day one of next season for the Broncos? Because, I mean, he's got a year up on all these other guys in Sean Payton's offense. So unless you would bring in somebody like a Jameis Winston as a bridge or something like that, I mean, that would make a lot of sense, wouldn't it? And I think that would be disappointing to a lot of Broncos fans who want to see the next best thing. But it's like,
Yeah,
well, if
they're
you go
tired
to
of
last year's
bridges.
backup, they're tired of bridges. They're tired of building bridges. And I get that. So I think even the NFL draft, it's going to be such a fun offseason for us, Cody, because if the Broncos
Yeah.
do start looking that direction, it's never a direction that Sean Payton has gone as a head coach. I mean, when he was with the Saints, yes, he had Drew Brees, but he also had the end of Drew Brees' career where they had opportunity after opportunity, and we heard rumors and we saw the reports of the Saints trying to trade up for so-and-so, and the Saints really liking, Mac Jones, and the Saints really liking other guys in the draft, and just not ever pulling the trigger. He never took anybody higher than the third round. Garrett Grayson, I believe, the Colorado State guy. So it's going to be fascinating to see if he does take that approach. What does it look like? But ultimately, right now, I think it hinges on whether or not Russell Wilson is willing to redo that contract, because it doesn't, that's people realize this is the contract that Russ signed in 2022 doesn't even kick in until this coming year. He's paid a lot of guaranteed money already, but it doesn't even kick in until 2024.
Makes the dynamic very interesting. And look, I'd be curious to know what are George Payton and Sean Payton's conversations at the top level? What is obviously Greg Penner, the ownership group's thoughts on this? What are the conversations being had? Because as you mentioned, like, people don't realize, and for some reason, everyone wants to pile on George Payton about this, but Broncos ownership pushed for the extension to happen so they could get it out of the way before Lamar and everybody else reset the quarterback market. So for me, looking at this situation, I'm very curious to see what Denver's plan would be. We obviously posed the question, what would it look like if the Broncos moved on from Russell Wilson? But we also have to look at it. What if the Broncos and Russell Wilson, Sean Payton, decide to run it back? We'll break that down here on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos. Today's episode of Locked On Broncos is brought to you by the Game Time app. And if you've ever had a frustrating ticket buying experience, you know how much of a hassle it can be when you run into issues like running out of tickets, being told that there are tickets available, and them following through right when you go to purchase them. Well, you don't have to worry about that with the Game Time app. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their best price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. You get last minute tickets, flash deals, zone deals, as we had talked about, easy to find and buy tickets for every kind of event going on in your area, whether it's sports, whether it's music events, comedy shows. They get everything near you. Game Time is the only ticketing app that gives you complete peace of mind with your purchase. See the view from your seat before you buy so you know exactly what to expect when you arrive. They have all-in prices which show you your total up front so you know that you're getting a great deal without any of the hidden fees. You can buy tickets in seconds with just 2 taps on the Game Time app. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last-minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. As we jump into the fourth quarter action here on today's episode of Locked On Broncos, we're going to take a look at what would it look like for the Broncos if Sean Payton, Russell Wilson, they run it back here in 2024. What needs to be upgraded around them? We just want to say thank you so much to everybody in Broncos Country for tuning in, making us your first listen of the day every single day. Just a reminder, you can watch us on YouTube. You can get us wherever you get your podcasts for free. So thank you so much to everybody in Broncos Country. And even when the season ends here in 2 weeks, Sayre and myself, we have you covered every single day all year long, because for the true fan, there is never an off season. So with that said here, we posed the question in the last segment, what would it look like if Denver parted from Russell Wilson? Now let's take a look at what would it look like for the Broncos if they run it back with Russ this upcoming season. I think ideally, to the scenario you mentioned, Sayre, if Denver's going to run it back with Russ, something's going to have to change. He's going to have to restructure his contract in one way or the other versus having to go and allocate that to different guys, which that's still going to happen, but you're going to need a collective effort if you hope to run it back and try to build on something in 2024. In your opinion, if Russell Wilson, Sean Payton, the dynamic between them, they run it back next year, what would need to change with the offense? What would they need to look to add or to upgrade here this offseason around these two guys specifically?
It's a really great question because you know me, Cody, I've been pounding the table for more pass catchers, and I think that's still a situation where the Broncos do need to look to address. I mean, I don't know if that means moving off of Jerry Jeudy, swapping him out, getting him a new situation. I don't know what it means for Courtland Sutton. Tim Patrick, would love to see Tim Patrick get back out there on the field for the Denver Broncos, but I don't know what that situation will look like financially. The tight end position, of course, needs to be addressed because we don't know what you're going to get from Greg Dulcich. So I think that's one of the biggest things that you have to look at is if we're keeping Russell Wilson, we need to make sure we have pass catchers that suit his skill set best, which means that we need guys that can win vertically down the field. We need guys that can win after the catch. And I think you have Marvin Mims right now, who's really growing as a rookie. And, you know, he's made some mistakes, but he's made some big plays. And I think he's only going to get better in year 2. So I do think Marvin Mims fits great with Russell Wilson as well as Courtland Sutton. Those two guys fit great. And we know that him and Tim Patrick, Russell Wilson and Tim Patrick, get along really well. They had great chemistry in their first training camp together before ultimately Tim Patrick suffered the injury, right? So I think that's a situation right there that you have to look at is the wide receiver tight end group. Is that where you want it to be specifically tailored to Russ's skill set?
And I would say right now, it's certainly not tailored that way. And we saw it, like when Cortland went down, it was like, okay, primarily at one point, Russell Wilson was like 13 of 17 completions. 8 of those 13 completions were to running backs in the game at one point in that third quarter there. And that's not on Russ. Like, that's where it's like, okay, where is the design to get maybe a guy like Lil Jordan Humphrey, who's got size and has got height advantage, getting him the ball, or even Lucas Kroll? Like, Lucas Kroll, I think his first target came before his touchdown there. So for me, it's like, okay, Denver, we talked about this all year. Not having Greg Dulcich this year, I think, has been a big issue for Denver's offense. The true pass catching tight end weapon has been an issue because it's been non-existent. Like, Adam Troutman is a reliable outlet option, but he's not a guy that's going to, scare defenses up the vertical seam, or even in terms of, hey, you got to worry about him on a down in and down out basis here from a pass catching standpoint, the way you do with other tight ends around the NFL. And that, to me, I think is a huge issue. I think Denver has something with Lucas Kroll. I think Sean Payton's starting to see it. I think good things can happen when you try to feature Lucas Kroll a little bit. But you can't bank on or rely at this point, and it's unfortunate. You cannot rely on Greg Dulcich as being the answer here. And I know a lot of people are going to be mad at this, but a lot of people are also going to be like, well, you can't really rely on Tim Patrick because of his injuries. I think the biggest question I have here, I've been seeing Tim Patrick move here lately. He looks good, Sayre. He's moving really well. Obviously, he would not be able to come back because, he's on IR, happened in training camp, but I think he's making great progress. I think he should be ready for training camp this upcoming year, when Denver prepares for the new season. But for me, it's, with that said, Tim's coming off of an ACL and then an Achilles injury in back-to-back years. With that, there's going to be some grace. There's going to be some, hey, don't expect him to be his best self just yet, because he's going to have to try to get comfortable from a mental standpoint of being out there with the pads on again, running routes, doing things, taking contact. And that's going to carry over. Like if he makes it through training camp, I think the Broncos will bring him back. But if he makes it through training camp, it's like, okay, hey, is that production going to be there in the regular season? These injuries, it takes a while for guys to come back. Look at OBJ. Look how long it's taken OBJ to kind of get back to who he is after not only, he's torn his ACL, he's torn his Achilles, but now look how he is in Baltimore. It's taken some time for him after suffering that ACL tear in that Super Bowl to get to where OBJ looks like OBJ of old again. So it's going to take time for Tim. This is a good draft class for wide receivers. Can Denver get a big or an explosive speedster as well to pair with Marvin Mims, Cortland Sutton, whoever else? I just don't know if you're going to run it back with Lil Jordan Humphrey or even Traquan Smith. I don't even think you're going to run it back here with Brandon Johnson in this situation either. Denver needs to upgrade here. But they also need to upgrade, Sayre, in my opinion, on the offensive line from a protection standpoint. Like Lloyd Cushenberry set to become a free agent. Are you bringing him back? Or are you going to run with a new center? To me, this is a huge, huge question about the Broncos in terms of sustainability here on the offense.
Yeah, the front office is going to have to decide whether or not Lloyd Cushenberry has proven himself to be a foundational piece of the roster, or whether he's kind of a proof of concept that Zach Strief in this offensive line can get the most out of guys who have struggled in the past or guys who are unproven, right? Because Lloyd Cushenberry had 3, I would say, pretty bad years before, that this coaching staff got to town. And that was with Mike Munchak on the staff previously. I know Butch Berry was there last year, but Lloyd Cushenberry had his struggles, and I wonder if he's proof of concept that they think, hey, we can insert anybody into that center spot, or if they said, hey, he's really grown into a core piece of this roster. That's going to be a really interesting scenario. A question that I want to throw out here is kind of playing devil's advocate a little bit. It kind of feels like all the momentum has shifted right to Russell Wilson not likely being in Denver in 2024. It kind of just feels like that's the way it's going. The relationship between he and Payton, the contract situation, 2025 option, all this, etc. Do you think with the Broncos, the way they started the season at 1-5, given that that was mostly the defense's issue there, do you think they look at next year and they say, if the defense plays at even an average level for all 17 games, let's say, they just don't bottom out like they did in the first 6 games of the year. If they play at even an average level, we've shown that over time, like we could win 9, 10, 11 games with this team. If it doesn't go as badly as it does, that may be your best argument for keeping Russ, because he is completing a high percentage of throws. He does have 31 total touchdowns this season. I know people don't like to talk about like stats lie and the numbers lie and things like that, but he does have 31 total touchdowns. Is that an interesting scenario to you to think about? If the defense doesn't bottom out at the beginning of the year, how different this team could be?
No, 100%. And that's a valid point. And Denver still, even with those circumstances that you just mentioned, they still have a chance to finish with 9 wins this season, which is unbelievable. I never thought we'd be talking about this after the 1-5 start, even though things have gone bad. Look, Denver, we talked about it. Playoff hopes more than likely done, folks. Like mathematically, there's a 5% chance, but we're not sitting here saying, oh, they have a chance. It's going to happen. Like at this point, the writing's on the wall. It's not going to happen for them this season, even though the NFL's been wild. Unfortunately, like now it's like, okay, hey, what can you build on going into next season? And that's where ultimately all these questions are going to come to a head here. We'll have you covered every step of the way this offseason. We'll also have you covered every step of the way here this week as the Broncos prepare to host the Los Angeles Chargers on New Year's Eve. You can get all that coverage here on Locked On Broncos. But I'll wrap up today's episode of the show here, folks. Thank you once again for tuning in, making us your first listen. Enjoy the rest of your day. If you're here in Colorado, snowy conditions on this Tuesday. Make sure you stay safe. If you have to be on the roads, drive safely, drive slow. Hope you had a Merry Christmas. We appreciate you so much. We'll see you tomorrow for a brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.